Excellent. Deep tech. So we've had a really fantastic context setting from Tabello, and what we want to do now is dig a little bit deeper, go into some of the perhaps stickier, grimier areas, issues we're having, but also all of the fantastic opportunities that you've laid out as well. My name's Jo, as I was very beautifully introduced, and I run a consultancy called Voxian Communications, and we really help pre-Series B tech startups with their positioning and their getting the complexity out of the story and telling really clear stories for marketing communications to the people that matter. So just to go into a little bit more detail on our panel here, we've got Tabello, who you've met from Savant Technology Incubator. Obviously, extensive experience in the tech ecosystem space, investing, and just generally supporting tech startup entrepreneurs across various different industries. So fantastic to have you. Deep tech, I fangirl out on, and this panel is like top notch. So honestly, I'm really honored to have you all. Then we have Tabello here. So he's the co-founder CEO of Butlatle AI, which is pioneering natural language processing solutions for African languages, just to really help with accessibility and user engagement across the continent. And then we have Dr. Gargi Mishra here, an expert in emerging tech and innovation. And Dr. Mishra specializes in foresight and strategy. So she's going to be hopefully looking into the crystal ball a little bit, seeing what we've got to look forward to. And all of the work that she's been doing really contributes to the advancement of deep tech initiatives globally. So excellent to have you all. So, like I mentioned, I love deep tech. It's just so fast moving from an innovation standpoint, not necessarily from an investment standpoint, and we'll get into that. But I just like it because it's so foundational to a lot of the innovation that is occurring around the continent and globally. And because it relies on advanced scientific and engineering complex issues, it's really creating new industries and solving problems at their root. So that's why I find it really exciting. I've had my fair share of time in deep tech startups myself. And so it's really good to just be here, seeing what the future holds for deep tech in Africa, but also how African innovation can support the world. Quick figure that I was reading over the weekend was, according to the UNDP, over the past decade, we've seen deep tech startups across Africa raise approximately $3 billion in funding, which accounts for about 15% of overall funding raised. So all things considered, we're not talking small numbers, and by all accounts, it's only going to increase. So let's dive into the conversation. I'd like to start just with a bit of jargon busting. I think deep tech can be a little bit of a buzzword, particularly in the investment space. So let's start there. What really makes deep tech, and particularly in the African context? I'll start with you. I think you're on.
Yeah, you can hear me loudly. Generally, I don't really need a mic, but yeah. So I like that question and a lot, because when you say deep tech and then you look at the tech state of Africa, what we see majority of funding coming in fintech. And then we hear about deep tech, and then most of if you are new to a startup space, you start thinking about, what is this bird now? But actually, deep tech is, like Tabello said in his presentation very beautifully, it's solving the complex problem. It takes a lot of R&D and research, and it's always very disruptive. That's the one sign of it. So for example, Neuralink or SpaceX is a very bright example. And it's not just a Western example. In South Africa, Sasol has a hydrogen green project, which is solving the energy problem. Then we have the RC example of drone farming. So if you look at all these examples, either it's a gene project in Nigeria, they are all solving bigger humanity problem. And tech is just an enabler. But then when we come into tech startup space, it's always about fast-paced technology, very consumer-focused, very instant gratification. And that's where I think the struggle also lies, which you mentioned. Yes, there is a big money, but there is a lack of founders and also the investors, because it's very, not, both of them don't have patience to be in that game for a longer time to invest. But I do see the space now open up with accelerated AI and connected world. It's growing, and we have our own problem, like you likely said. And it's the right time to be in that deep tech space to solve those problems, because technology is on your side and it's cheaper than ever before and accessible than ever before. So, yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you. Go ahead.
Dumelang. So I completely agree with Dr. Mishra and what Tabelo said earlier on. But I think deep tech isn't just about like scientific and engineering advancements. It's about like finding proper, impactful applications of that advancement. And in the context of Africa, I think it positions us in a very unique and powerful place, because we've got a lot of challenges that can uniquely be addressed with proper research and development, right? We don't have to necessarily just be consumers of the way things are done globally. But if we invest properly in the key areas that impact us on the continent, then we can use deep tech for good, and we can leapfrog some of these solutions, right? So, and there's a couple of cases where you see a global solution kind of being pushed into Africa because we haven't really done the proper deep research ourselves. When we started Botlhale, we saw Google launching their AI assistant to book a hair appointment, and they launched isiZulu as well. And to us, we're like, this is great, but in Africa, we're going to use that for banking. We're going to use the technology to get people to have access to financial service through financial institutions. And you look at the Zulu model, it doesn't work in our environment where we mix and match languages. You start with a hello, you end up with a how's it, you throw in some Zulu there, and we need proper research into spaces like this that's properly catered for our context. And our language is just one part of it. There's so many other things that I think need proper investment, research and development.
I think for me, without sounding very complicated, it's more of it's solutions that are sort of packaged through a combination of a good technology stack that works effectively to solve fundamental problems. I think for me, in its very simplest form, that's deep tech.
Yeah, that's great. And, we touched on a couple of examples there, but I'd like to get a handle on, from your perspective, which sectors do you believe are already showing outsized potential in this area? Let's start from that side this time.
Let's start with Tapelo.
Obviously the sectors that we're involved in, but I won't touch on those.
No, please do. Please do.
So I think definitely, customer engagement across all sectors. So if you really think about, if we look at generative AI, one of the biggest use cases of the technology is customer engagement through enterprises. So I had a meeting yesterday with an American company, and they were the largest consumer of Microsoft AI, and all they were doing was monitoring phone calls. So that's one key area that I think will be really disrupted. There'll be a lot of automation that comes into play over the next couple of, I want to say years, but it will probably be months. And then I think healthcare as well. There's a lot of really good work being done, and I think there's a startup that's going to present here today, CureRoot, doing drug discovery on the African continent, looking at African plants which haven't been properly researched. And I think that's a massive opportunity that's been overlooked for a very long time.
For me, I support the same that you're saying, particularly when you look at the health tech, maybe because within Savant, I'm one of the leads that actually interact with those founders. We have seen how they've implemented solutions that assist in an emergency department, for instance, also in the early detection of very specific diseases. In fact, there's a startup that we supported working on early detection of TB, and in a very efficient manner in terms of trying to reduce those false positives and in selecting those patients that eventually go to use more expensive diagnosis processes. So it tells you that it sort of fast-track the patient throughput. And we've also worked with startups in the agri-tech that I've mentioned on the keynote. So I think those, for me, are the most sectors that I've looked at I always shy away from, maybe it's come from a different cut from a different cloth. I always shy away from sort of researching the statistics in terms of the trends, but it's more of the things that I'm seeing on the ground, and those two sectors are the ones that I've noticed.
Yeah, fantastic. Anything else from you, Dr. Garg?
And I agree both of them, but then also I look at the opportunity space. And I think sustainable technology is a space where there's a lot of gap. Most of the startups coming are from outside, and they're not always solving the local problem. And then clients spend a lot of money customizing them. And there's a very niche space in ESG space, be it energy emission, energy saving, even mapping the whole process manufacturing and how to do the lean process and energy optimization. So yes, health, very big, of course, and agriculture. But then there is a small segment which is very high rewarding, quick win space I see is often neglected.
Excellent. Lots to look forward to there. We wouldn't be here if we didn't start talking a little bit about the capital question. So, deep tech can be very capital intensive, often very long term. You're not going to see results overnight. So what are the biggest hurdles then that a lot of the African founders here could be facing, and how are we going to overcome those?
I think mostly with the founders that we have worked with, we've realized that, I agree with you, there's a need of significant funding, but more often than not, it's more of how do you become lean in terms of arriving to a product or an MVP. And I think that's also the missing puzzle, to say how do we become efficient in executing on these projects and make sure that we got proper funding. So we have seen challenges that there is no enough risky funds to actually invest. There is a lack of patience in terms of when you get to revenue, because there's a lot of technical validation that needs to happen. Mostly there's a lot of regulatory stuff that they need to get over. And those are the challenges that you find a lot of deep tech companies sort of are hindered to get to market because of that. Even when functionally the technology is ready, there's just not enough time to go through those hurdles, even if funding is there. Sometimes it's the lack of funding, that patient funding that say, I'll give you this amount of money to go through the process. I think mostly those are the challenges in terms of de-risking, funding to de-risk those technologies.
And Thapelo, from your perspective and your experience as well, there's the funding side, and you can talk from perhaps the founder perspective, but also the other support and resources that are actually needed to build a deep tech startup.
Yeah, sure. I think you summed up the challenges quite well, and it's great to hear from someone who's also an investor acknowledging those key points. But really, I think from a founder's perspective, your journey is really navigating what some might call the valley of death, where the science or the scientific thing that you're developing has a lot of potential, but the path and the time it takes to get to commercialization and revenue is a bit challenging. And because of that, traditional investment structures fail to understand, and they're not necessarily patient or have the sufficient risk appetite to take on such projects. And it's sometimes interesting because we expect African deep tech companies to be able to compete on the global stage, but we don't equip them with sufficient resources, right? So we're sending people off to war with butter knives, and everyone else is using a machine gun. And I mean, by nature, as African founders, we will be more efficient and more creative in how we approach some of these things due to these resource constraints. And I mean, fortunately, there are resources available from big tech players. Your Amazons, your Googles have done really well in supporting deep tech research by giving compute credits that, honestly speaking, our business wouldn't have been able to develop more than half the things we've developed had it not been for the compute support, which wasn't necessarily in the form of capital or cash, but it was a key component of what we needed to develop the technology. But I think, definitely African founders doing this sort of research need to be properly equipped, and we need a more more patient capital that's open to that sort of risk, and understanding that, the revenue side of it might be more of a lagging metric than anything else. Because you speak to investors, they're like, okay, how much are you generating today? So your multiple that you want at your valuation is 200 or whatever, without really considering the specific technology that you're developing.
Absolutely. And you mentioned corporate partnerships there being really, really key. And you've had some experience of ecosystem building. Could you give me a little bit more background on that and how you see that supporting the founder journey?
Yeah, so pretty much like we earlier spoke on similar topic, like we were discussing. As you said, it's all a valid point you raised, but then also I do believe translating your ideas into a story. So storytelling and communication is important, and also being in the right room. Sometimes it's very important because you might have a very good idea, but you might not be in the right room. So those are the two things I have learned with my own mistakes, and also speaking to the founders, co-founders along the last 20 years of my journey. Pretty much every time when something, either it's lack of patience or lack of funding, but then also sometimes just not able to translate that idea and tell that story better.
Yeah, and one of those right rooms is this one, I think. So we're in the right place. That's great. So, we spoke a little bit about Africa to the world, like scaling globally. And to Tapelo's point, we can't have our founders going out with butter knives when everybody else has got machine guns. So, what's really needed, I suppose, technically, operationally, commercially, for the innovations that are happening here that have global relevance to actually make it globally?
Yeah, it's more of an ecosystem. I think I touched on it, right? So if we get the better coordination of the ecosystem and make sure that the players that really assist these startups, they jump off from the KPI kind of trap, and ensure that while we organize to make sure that the ecosystem is effective, it should be with reference to the founder at the center to say our contribution actually contributing onto the progressive nature of the startup, moving from where we find them to where they are, and at the same time then tick those boxes. But more often you find that ecosystem, it's a bit siloed, fragmented, and founders do go through so many programs, even non-commercial programs, that once you start talking to them about another program on Incubator, they just shut off immediately and say, now I need funds, because you're not getting tangible results from those programs. And you get through them and you get that certificate that you've been through this particular program. But once you start to talk to those founders, there's no evidence of that. So maybe, which is a very small percentage, it's because working with deep tech, it's interesting technologies, but we do find some of the funny technologies that comes, and people will tell you that can actually shift the position of the moon and produce more electricity from it. So I think there's the other challenging part where some are just a little bit more dreamers than others.
Yeah, no, I like what you said, but I like to say when we talk about ecosystem, we often very much centered around corporate ecosystem incubators and all. But when I launched, like now 2014, Mining Innovation Portal, and even now when I look at other startup ecosystem, the biggest gap I see, because now I work a lot with universities as well for foresight and future thinking, the biggest gap is teaching those skills at very young stage and enabling them to identify the opportunity. So it's not that we don't have talent, we have a lot of opportunity because full of challenges like you showed earlier. It's about ecosystem should be inclusive of this education system so that teach them young. That's what I believe.
And just to add on that, Joe, if I can, it's one of the challenges as well is to find what we call competition / grant junkies. There are a lot of founders that are very good at pitching, and they are the ones that get awarded this funding, this limited funding, right? And you'll find that they appear in each website. If you Google now, in the portfolio, in each side when they say our portfolio, that company will always be there, simply because they know they've mastered how to communicate to these potential funders. So if we don't interrogate really the problem that these startups are solving, we might be awarding funding to startups that are good at pitching, but not necessarily good in terms of the products that they produce. So once they get to a certain stage, they fail to get onto the international market, because when they are required to start pitching in a commercial perspective, then it becomes a challenge, because they can't communicate that value other than saying we need our burn rate is X and we need more funding to get to a certain point. So I think from a founder perspective, it's to make sure that we're actually backing the founders that really deserve to be funded.
Yeah, that's great. And I'm seeing my cue, so I think just to wrap up, let's do a bit of future casting. I always think 10 years is way too long. Like, we could all be living in Mars in 10 years. So let's say 3 to 5 years. Where do you see this going for Africa, for African startups, and into the world? Let's start with our resident futurist.
Yeah, now the new title. So pretty much, even if I look at globally, and if we reflect back on the Tech State report and all the trends where it's heading for, of course, climate adaptive technology, agriculture space, lot of health care space, and why, and there is one connecting dot. As a human, we want to live longer, healthier, and happy. And that's why most of the space will be. And then bring back to Africa, look at the basic challenges and opportunities have in clean tech. When I say clean tech, it means providing clean air, clean water, clean agriculture in terms of healthy food. So it's a lot of opportunity and a lot of growth. And if you look at the trend, because we're talking 3 to 5 years, it's pretty much showing same investment trend, but then also a lot of scope and emerging in 5-year time, and especially in 10-year time, will be in sustainable material or alternate material, be it luxury, like alternate leather, or alternate food, which is 3D printed food, which is already coming in China, almost very common. And then also sustainable infrastructure material, very much needed right now in continent. So that's the key space. As a futurist or as a trend forecaster, I see is growing forward, and the space to play along for somebody like Savant. I'm sure you're already paying attention in that space.
No, I'm not going to say anything. I think a lot is dependent in terms of where we're going. It's dependent on how, if we assess stuff differently and if we invest differently, then I think we will go far. There's just a bit of challenges when you get ideas being validated online, which is something I'm against. We need to make sure that these founders actually demonstrate that product market fit on the ground with the actual client or actual user. But if you're still going to get, I'm not against statistics, but if you're still going to back like stuff with statistics, and lacking like on the ground visibility in terms of ensuring that you understand the problem and the effectiveness of that solution, I think then we're going to have a challenge. So it's just a matter of better coordination, defining challenges and solution differently, then we'll go fire. So I think it's going to take more than 5 years. I know that you like that.
Yeah, fantastic. And Tapelo?
So one major trend that I see, just purely because of the area that we operate in, so as mentioned, we help businesses engage customers in their preferred languages, so in African languages. And one major trend in that space is the level of automation. And it also raises a bit of a concern, given that, you know, the BPO sector and that customer service sector, call centers, are a big strategic driver for employment in South Africa, and the government has really backed that industry. But when you look at the technology and how it's developing, it's posing a major threat, not just locally, because the way it's positioned is to serve a global market, but there's a lot of technology coming out today from Salesforce, from Zendesk, from all of these major engagement players automating that. And I think 5 years is a bit too long to wait to tackle that issue, to talk about employment and how the technology is affecting that. I think, 18 to 24 months, we're going to start seeing some really scary stats in that specific industry. So I think as much as we were pushing the technology, we should intentionally deal and tackle the societal problems that come with the technology.
Excellent, and I think that's a fantastic note to end on. I think all of our speakers will be around for questions during coffee breaks and the likes. But thank you, everybody. A lot to look forward to. Thanks.